Always curious, Professor George Washington Carver committed his life to scholarship, community, and the integration of his Christian faith with higher education. It's in this spirit we welcome you to Carver Classrooms.
Hi, my name is Kristen Benningen. I'm a professor at Washington University in St. Louis in the Department of Psychological and Brain Sciences and the Linguistics program. In our last video, I told you just a tiny bit about what linguistics is and why you might care. And in this one, we're going to talk about some of the important terms when we talk about language. So what is a language? What is a dialect? Given the globalized and mobile society in which we live, your ministry context very likely includes people who speak different languages and dialects, or at least who have different accents from one another. And there are a lot of misconceptions out there about these terms. So in this video, I want to give you a linguist's take. A language, we would say, is a spoken or signed communication system shared by a speech community. A dialect, by contrast, is a spoken or signed communication system used by a speech community, just with a little more definition to it, so usually defined along regional or social lines of some sort. What I want to do, though, is dispel a few misconceptions about this term dialect. So for linguists, we use this to describe basically a sub-variety of a language. In common usage, this term is sometimes used to try to get at some idea of the way people speak as being substandard or incorrect or slang. And that usage of the word dialect is not the linguist's usage of the word at all. And I would love people to get away from using it in that way. Then we've got accent, right? Accent really refers to specifically the way the language variety is pronounced. So in linguistic terms, we would say it refers to the phonetic and phonological aspects of variation within a language. So a dialect is a subvariety of a language, and the term accent refers to the way you pronounce language. The really important point to take away here is that if you speak at all or sign, you speak a dialect and you have an accent. This is the biggest takeaway that I want my students to take from my classes, this idea that no matter what variety you use, it has a way that you pronounce things and a way that you say things, and that's what dialects and accents are. So nobody gets to not have a dialect or not have an accent. You have one, it's just different from someone else's. So we all have an accent. It's not that I don't and you do, right? And I think just that little simple shift in thinking about language can really go a long way to helping people understand language and understand one another just a little bit better, that nobody gets to be unaccented. So one important concept when we talk about different dialects is mutual intelligibility. The idea is if speakers of two different language varieties can understand one another, we would say that they're speaking two dialects of a single language. Even though they might use different words or pronounce things really differently, if they can understand one another, we'd say, okay, they're speaking two dialects of a single language. So you can think of American English versus British English, right? Very different ways of pronouncing things, even some different words, different terminology, but you can pretty well carry on a conversation across those dialect boundaries. The conventional use of the terms dialect and language, however, don't always line up with this linguistic rule. One nice example of this is the way people talk about Chinese varieties. So the way people tend to use this term is to talk about different dialects of Chinese. So I speak Mandarin, you speak Cantonese, and these are different dialects. The thing is, a person who speaks Mandarin and a person who speaks Cantonese don't actually understand each other. So as linguists, we would classify those as two separate languages. So this is a case where that word dialect, the way it's commonly used to talk about these varieties, differs from this sort of linguistic definition. We also have cases where languages are called different languages, but actually the speakers can understand one another. Languages like Bosnian, Croatian, and Serbian are actually mutually intelligible, but they're called these three different languages, right? The other thing is that mutual intelligibility itself is a really complicated thing. For American English speakers, usually it's pretty easy to understand somebody who speaks British English, but Scottish is a lot more difficult, right? We still call those all English, but the level of intelligibility definitely does vary between different varieties. There's also cases of what we call dialect continua, where speakers of two languages kind of on a border, say between the Netherlands and Germany, Dutch and German speakers can pretty well understand each other. But as you move away from that border, by the time you get to the ends, speakers don't understand each other anymore. So this idea of like, are Dutch and German two dialects of one language or two separate languages? If you're using that rule of mutual intelligibility, it sort of depends on where you actually ask that question, right? So we use this as a rule of thumb to sort of help us talk about what's a dialect, what's a language. If you understand one another, we say, but you're speaking quite differently. We say you speak different dialects of a single language. But in real life, there's a lot of gray areas here as well. Another important concept when we talk about different dialects, different accents, is the idea of a standard dialect. So when we talk about standard American English or standard British English or standard Mandarin or whatever you might refer to, usually that term is just sort of used to label the variety that's used by the most powerful members of society. So political leaders, media, people of higher socioeconomic status. It tends to be sort of their variety of a language gets called the standard. It tends to be then what's taught in schools and taught to non-native speakers who want to learn the language. And we would just say then that these standards are the dialects of sort of overt prestige in a society. Not everyone speaks the standard, of course. And this idea of prestige is actually interesting. Within linguistics, we talk about both overt and covert prestige. The idea being there's, one dialect or collection of dialects that sort of is associated with, social prestige. But lots of speakers will maintain their other different non-prestigious varieties because that marks their community, right? It's a part of communicating with the people that are close to you. It's a part of, your culture and your community. So even if that's not overtly prestigious, we call that idea covert prestige. There are personal reasons to maintain even a non-standard dialect. With respect to standards, I think I mentioned this already, but it's important to remember that it's really often a collection of varieties that are considered to be standard. And this is true in American English. There's a fair bit of variation even within what most people would classify as standard English in America. And basically it just amounts to being sort of American English that's not pronounced with features that are particularly characteristic of a specific regional variety. Okay, so one really important point to take away here is that linguistically speaking, no one dialect or language is better or more systematic or more logical than any other. Every language variety is a rule-governed system and an effective means of communicating. Even though our different varieties can divide us, so think back to the story of Babel, right? We see the redemption of this in the moment of Pentecost, where everyone hears the gospel in their own languages. It's not that they all understand the same language. That wasn't the miracle. The miracle was that they were hearing in their own languages. And we see this even further in the vision of the new creation in Revelation, where there's a great multitude that no one could number from every nation, from all tribes, from all peoples, and from all languages. So we see, even in this picture of God's coming kingdom, the different languages are a part of that picture. Okay, so to wrap up this video, a few takeaway points. One, if we use language, we have a dialect and we have an accent. We don't get to not have one. We all have one. Even if we speak a signed language, there's dialect and accent. Also, no language variety is linguistically superior to another. They're all valid, rule-governed forms of communicating. And our feelings about dialects that aren't considered standard in our language are not linguistic. Those are social judgments. And finally, in the Bible, linguistic diversity is celebrated and included in God's kingdom. Next time, we'll talk a bit more about variation within languages. Thanks for listening.